Miami never rests. Even when the sun dips below the skyline, its heat lingers like a phantom, clinging to every surface, seeping into every breath. I've always loved that about this place. The way it hides its rot beneath pastel skies and endless summer nights. It makes my work easier. Blood dries fast here. It blends into the streets, forgotten before it can stain. And yet, something about tonight feels different. A shift in the air. A weight too heavy to be simple humidity. The Trinity killer is back. It doesn't make sense, of course. I made sure of that. I watched Arthur Mitchell shudder under my blade, felt the life drain from him, heard the last useless beats of his monstrous heart. The plastic wrap beneath him had been slick with his final moments. There was no room for error. So why, then, is Miami drowning in fresh blood? It started with Angel Batista, a crime scene like any other on the surface corner of 12th and Ocean. Late-night beachgoers crowded past the tape for a glimpse of the aftermath. Batista, my friend, my colleague, sprawled over the asphalt, his body pale beneath the flashing red and blue lights. The forensics team moved around him like vultures, picking apart every detail. Deb stood off to the side, her face carved from stone. "He's gonna be okay, right?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, her cigarette trembling between two fingers. She didn't meet my gaze. I wanted to lie. I wanted to tell her what she needed to hear, but the blood was pooling wrong. Too much of it. Angel's chest rose in tiny, shallow gasps, but I knew the signs. He was already slipping beneath the tide. Masuka knelt beside the body, his gloved hands tracing the deep cuts in Batista's torso. "This is methodical," he muttered. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. A lie, an echo of something else. I had seen these wounds before. 3 slashes, parallel, deliberate, like the blade had been guided not by rage, but by ritual. This wasn't an act of desperation. This wasn't random. This was something else. Trinity didn't target men. Trinity didn't leave signs of struggle. And yet, Angel Batista lay carved open like an offering. His throat worked, fighting for air, his mouth forming a single word. His bloodied fingers gripped my wrist with more strength than I thought possible. Wait! The ambulance was already screaming down Collins Avenue, pedestrians scattering like insects beneath its blinding lights. I could still feel his grip even as they dragged him away. It was a plea, a warning, and warnings were not to be ignored. Later that night, when the city grew quieter and the tropical storm pulled thick clouds over the moon, I returned to my lab. Trinity was precise. Trinity was controlled. His patterns unfolded like clockwork. Women in bathtubs, mothers falling to their death, fathers beaten to pulp with claw hammers. Never this. Unless it wasn't Trinity's work at all. Unless someone wanted me to believe it was. I stared at Batista's blood under the fluorescence. The slides lined up like ghosts trapped in glass. Something wasn't adding up. Trinity's cycle was sacred to him, unbreakable. The ritual tethered him. He never deviated. Batman never forgot Gotham. I curled my fingers around the edge of the counter, the weight of realization curdling in my gut. This was personal. Dexter Morgan's friends were being targeted. Something else twisted in my mind, a dark thought creeping its way up from my subconscious. Had I dragged another monster into my world? The door creaked open, sending a sliver of light arcing across the floor, and I turned to find Deb silhouetted in the frame. "I checked the traffic cams," she started, her voice tight, like she had seen something she couldn't explain. And Deb flicked her phone screen toward me, paused footage from an intersection a block away from Batista's attack. A grainy figure standing in the shadow of a streetlight. Tall, slender, impossible. Arthur Mitchell was dead. And yet someone wearing his face had watched Angel Batista bleed. The ghosts of my past were hungry, and they'd decided to start feeding. The footage stared back at me from Deb's phone screen, a ghost made of pixels and static. My mind clawed for explanations, but none fit neatly into reality. Arthur Mitchell was ash. His blood had blended into the plastic sheets beneath him. His breath had rattled into silence, and I had ensured he would never hunt again. And yet, you see it too, right? Deb's voice was hoarse, like she'd spent the last hour trying to argue herself out of the impossible. I nodded, my throat tightening. Where was this taken? Corner of 9th and Collins. Her fingers clenched around the phone. Right before Angel got carved up like a fucking Thanksgiving turkey. The buzzing in my skull wouldn't stop. Logic fought to take hold, to carve some kind of order into the chaos. Trinity had never touched anyone in my circle. He had his code, same as I did, a twisted rhythm that bound him to his rituals. A figure dressed like him, moving like him, reappearing after all these years. It wasn't just coincidence. This was orchestrated. And I wasn't the only player in the game. The city pulsed beneath me as I drove down Ocean Drive, headlights slicing through the syrupy darkness. Batista was still alive, for now, but that wouldn't last if whoever this was had a plan. And they did. Oh, they did. This wasn't a sloppy copycat. Whoever had done this had studied the original, not just the crime scenes but the man behind them. Every cut on Batista's body had been deliberate, intentional. Revenge? No, that would have been aimed at me, not at those close to me. But this was a pattern unwinding in the shadows, designed not to end me, but to isolate me, piece by piece. The hunter was becoming the hunted. I pulled up outside the hospital, the stench of disinfectant curling into my nostrils as I made my way inside. Deb had stayed on scene, drowning herself in caffeine and stress, but I needed to see Batista. He wasn't just another victim. He was a message. The fluorescent lights made his skin look waxy, his arms tethered by IVs like marionette strings. I slipped through the door, quiet, careful. His eyes fluttered open at the movement, and for a moment, clarity burned through the sedatives coating his veins. Dex! His voice cracked, barely a whisper. I leaned closer. Who did this? An eternity passed in the space of a breath. Then his lips parted, forcing out a single, rasping word. Kyle. I bolted down my spine. Kyle Butler. The name I had used when I infiltrated Trinity's life. The name that should have died with Arthur Mitchell. I pulled back slowly, every nerve in my body tightening to a razor's edge. Batista knew, or someone had wanted him to know, and that meant I had far less time than I thought. The hospital was too quiet when I left, the night pressing in, thick and humid. My car felt smaller, like the air had been sucked from it, and the drive back to my apartment stretched unnaturally long. The specter of Arthur Mitchell danced in my thoughts, but it wasn't him I feared. No, Trinity was long gone, but his ghost had found a new vessel, and that vessel knew me better than they should. I barely had time to register the warning before my phone vibrated in my pocket. Unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Silence. Then, hello, Kyle. That voice. Smooth, measured, almost playful. But it wasn't Trinity's voice. No, this was something else. Someone else. Who is this? My own voice was steady, but beneath it, my dark passenger coiled, bristling. A soft chuckle. Oh, Dexter, I think you already know. Static crackled. Faint breathing on the other end. Deliberate. Controlled. Angel isn't the last. The voice continued, dripping with certainty. And if you don't stop me, you'll be the only one left. The line went dead. My grip tightened around the phone until the plastic groaned. This wasn't just about killing anymore. This was a game. A game designed to strip me of everything that kept me human. And I was running out of time. The line went dead, but the silence it left behind was deafening. My fingers flexed around the phone, knuckles pressing white. Whoever this was, whoever had stepped into Trinity's skin, they knew me. Not just the surface details, not just Dexter Morgan, blood spatter analyst, quiet and unassuming. No, they knew Kyle Butler. They knew the man I had become to get close to Arthur Mitchell. They knew how to gut me without ever laying a hand on me. I needed to move. The city felt different now, tremulous and raw. Every shadow a threat curling at the edge of my vision. Were they watching me even now? From the rooftops, the alleyways, the filmy reflection of streetlights in puddled gutters? My mind clawed at possibilities as I navigated the streets back to my apartment, the tires humming against pavement, a steady thrum that did little to drown out the echo of that voice. Hello, Kyle. Whoever was doing this, whoever had ripped open Batista and left him gasping in his own blood, they weren't just playing mind games. They were methodical, careful, precise in the way only a predator could be. The door to my apartment shut behind me with a hollow click, and I stood in the quiet dark, listening. No movement, no breath but my own, slow and steady. And yet I wasn't alone. The thing inside me, the dark passenger, stirred with unease. Danger. I moved swiftly, checking the locks, peeling back curtains, ensuring every entryway remained undisturbed. But I should have known better. A locked door is only a deterrent to the unmotivated. My breath slowed as I approached my desk. A small, unremarkable envelope sat at the center, pristine against the worn wood. I didn't touch it right away. I let the weight of it hang in the air, the act of intrusion thick with significance. Someone had been here. Someone had stepped into my space, traced their fingers over the life I had built, and left behind a message without a whisper of a footprint. In another life, I might have called it artistry. I tore the envelope open with measured care, unfolding the paper inside. 3 words, scrawled in deliberate ink. One down, Dexter. A slow exhale, a feeling akin to gravity shifting beneath my feet. So this was the game. I burned the note in the sink, watching the flames curl around the edges, devouring ink and paper alike until nothing remained but ash and the suffocating scent of carbon. Fire cleanses, but it does not erase. This wasn't over, and I was done waiting for the next move. I arrived at Miami Metro under the guise of work, slipping into the blood lab with ease. To anyone watching, I was just another night owl, a forensic analyst obsessed with his craft, sifting through the unanswered questions lurking beneath a microscope. And that wasn't untrue. Blood tells a story. Tonight, I needed it to tell mine. Batista's samples lay spread before me, collected in sterile vials, each one a chapter in the violence that had left him sprawled over the pavement. I traced the glass with my fingertips before selecting the first slide, aligning it beneath the scope. The patterns were distinctive. There were no mistakes, no random slashes made in struggle. The wounds had been placed, positioned just so. A message, written in blood. A signature. I compared, cross-referencing sample after sample, pulling up crime scene photos, scanning the depth of each incision against known cases, Trinity's case. And there it was. Not an exact match, but close enough. The spacing, the angles, it was as if someone had studied Trinity's technique in microscopic detail, reconstructed it piece by piece until it felt right in their hands. An imitator. But not just any imitator. A disciple. I stared, unblinking as realization settled in. My kills had always been precise, anchored in Harry's code, guided by a twisted sense of order. But Trinity had been different. His chaos had been wrapped in dogma, in an unshakable belief that his pattern was divine. And belief, true belief, had a way of living beyond the believer. I flicked through old case files, pulling up witness statements, anything that hinted at loose ends. Arthur Mitchell had been a family man, a father, a mentor, but mentors leave behind legacies. And hadn't I seen that myself in the wake of my own father's teachings? My finger hovered over a name, faint, buried in a supplemental report. Lance Robinson, a social worker, a volunteer at one of Trinity's charity projects. A man dismissed as a non-suspect in previous inquiries because he had no direct connection to the killings. But he had been close to Arthur, and the kind of man who watched, listened, learned. A snake in the tall grass, waiting for the right moment to strike. Kyle Butler. That name hadn't been forgotten, not in the places where it mattered. No, someone had remembered. Someone had understood what it meant. And now they were sharpening the knife. The weight of inevitability settled into my bones. If I didn't stop this, I wouldn't have to wonder what came next. Trinity's disciple had every intention of making sure I found out. The air in my lab had thickened, swollen with the weight of my own thoughts. The realization churned in me. Not just a theory, not just a possibility, but the truth clawing its way to the surface. Arthur Mitchell was dead, but his ghost had risen, draped in new flesh, carrying new purpose. Lance Robinson, a forgotten name buried within the margins of Trinity's life. A man dismissed, overlooked, slipping through the cracks just as I had once learned to do. A man who had watched, studied, learned. And now he was walking in his mentor's blood-soaked footsteps, carving a path through my life, one by one. The hospital lights bleached out the color of the world as I made my way back to Batista's room. The steady beep of machines measured out his survival in thin, fragile moments, but survival wasn't guaranteed. Not if Robinson had planned this the way I suspected. I wasn't the only one who knew Batista was still alive, which meant he wasn't safe. The hallway stretched long and silent, the shadow of my thoughts pressing against my ribs. I moved faster, my pulse threading out a violent rhythm against my temples. Then I saw the door, slightly ajar, a detail most would pass by, unnoticed in exhaustion or distraction. But not me. The dark passenger stirred, crackling through my veins, feeding me every fragment of warning my skin was too slow to register. Someone had been here, may still be. I slipped inside like a shadow, movement measured, perfect. Batista, still unconscious, still tethered to his wires, his pulse stretching across the monitor in careful frequency. The air was thick with him. Lance Robinson, his presence lingering like stale breath on cold glass. Then I saw it. A single drop of blood. Not Batista's. Fresh, vibrant. A smear against pristine white sheets. A calling card, left behind in arrogance or intent. Then, a whisper of movement. Too late. The moment broke into violence. A figure lunged from the dim corner of the room, blade flashing under artificial light. I pivoted, years of muscle memory snapping into place, my body twisting just out of reach as metal sliced the air where my throat had been. The blade buried itself deep into the pillow beside Batista's head. A surgical miss, precise and practiced. My elbow connected with ribs. A sharp grunt, a stumble, then silence. He was gone. The door shuddered against its frame as it swung, the emptiness beyond it swallowing him whole. I sprinted, my legs moving like they belonged to someone else, my vision sharpening to a deadly point. The hospital corridor stretched into nowhere, door after door, all closed, all leading to nothing. Gone. But not without proof. I turned back toward Batista's room, my pulse hammering behind my eyes. This hadn't been a kill. This had been a message. Promise. I approached Batista's bedside, my gaze flicking toward the smear of blood again, cataloging every detail. The smear wasn't random. It had been deliberate. A mark. A number. 2. 1 down, Dexter. Now Batista was marked. Next in line. The realization swallowed me whole, a sick weight pressing against my ribs. Robinson wasn't impulsive, wasn't reckless. He had planned this, mapped out every move with meticulous precision. He was slipping through my life, untouchable, dragging my world into ruin one cut at a time. And he would continue, until there was nothing left of Dexter Morgan to salvage. I left the hospital before Deb could arrive, before I had to explain what couldn't be explained. There was no denying it anymore. The hunt was on. But for the first time, it wasn't me doing the hunting. 2. It replayed in my mind as I drove, the number carved into Batista's sheets bleeding into my thoughts, staining every rational explanation I could grasp for. Lance Robinson wasn't trying to kill me. That would be too easy, too merciful. No, he wanted to unravel me, peel back each carefully constructed layer until only the raw nerve remained. How many pieces would he take before I had nothing left? Miami's night air felt heavier, the humidity suffocating against my skin as I pulled into my usual parking spot outside my apartment complex. The headlights bathed the damp pavement in 2 dull beams before cutting to black. I sat there for a moment, fingers curled tight around the wheel, listening to my own breathing. I wasn't just being hunted. I was being dissected. I stepped out of the car, my movements automatic, controlled. The weight of my father's code pressed against me, colder than ever. This was the moment Harry had warned me about, When the mask cracked, when my double life bled together, staining everything I had built. The question was, could I stop the collapse before there was nothing left? A flicker of movement in my peripheral vision snapped my attention to the shadows by my door. I stilled, breath catching at the unnatural stillness there. Too quiet, too deliberate. Then, a figure stepped forward. Deb. Her silhouette was rigid, fists clenched. "K is going on." I hesitated a moment too long. Deb's eyes narrowed. She was a cop first, a sister second. And worst of all, she was smart. He said Kyle Butler. Her voice was quieter now, calculated. Before he passed out. "You really want to tell me that's a coincidence?" The name had already wormed its way into her thoughts, into the space where she stored every unsolved puzzle, every stray inconsistency in my life that she hadn't been able to reconcile. Danger. I exhaled slowly. "You know I used a lot of names when I was undercover." "Bullshit." Her voice cut sharp. "You reacted." A million responses lined up in my mind, each carefully measured, each designed to redirect, to mislead. But Deborah Morgan was a bloodhound when she scented deception. A different tactic then. I let the tension show in my shoulders. Just enough. "I knew Arthur Mitchell," I admitted, giving her only half-truths wrapped in something like honesty. "I got close to him. Maybe someone found out and is using it to fuck with me." She studied me for a long moment, suspicion flickering behind her eyes. Then her jaw tightened. "If you're lying to me, Dexter, I swear to God." I forced something like reassurance into my voice. "I'm not. I was. And if I didn't stop Robinson, she was going to find out just how much." She exhaled roughly, running a hand through her hair before stepping back. "Fine. But we need to find this bastard before he finishes what he started." She turned on her heel and stalked toward her car, anger radiating off her like heat from the pavement. I watched her go, a cold weight settling in my chest. Deb wouldn't stop. She didn't know how, and that meant Robinson would come for her next. Couldn't allow that. For the first time in days, I felt something close to certainty as I stepped into my apartment and locked the door behind me. Trinity's cycle had always been about family. Robinson had taken that lesson to heart. If I wanted to beat him, I couldn't just anticipate his next move. I had to break the pattern entirely, and that meant becoming something even he couldn't predict. I moved through the dim apartment, my hands working without thought, preparing, planning, positioning each piece into place. My kill kit lay in its usual resting place, each tool carefully maintained, each instrument gleaming under the soft glow of the kitchen light. Harry's voice stirred in my mind, low and measured. "You can't let him win." No, I wouldn't. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was war. The weight of inevitability pressed against me as I assembled my tools, the ritual unfolding with the same mechanical precision that had governed my life for years. The plastic, the blades, the careful sterility of it all. These were my weapons, my shields against chaos. But this time they felt different. Less like protection, more like desperation. Lance Robinson wasn't just another loose thread. He was a fire set to the fabric of my existence, burning through everything I had worked to preserve. And fire, once kindled, doesn't stop until there's nothing left to consume. I traced the edge of a scalpel with my thumb, the weight familiar and steady. I would end this. I had to, before he tore away the last of my carefully crafted world. Before Deb, she was tangled in this now, too deep, too close. And she didn't have the luxury of knowing just how much danger she was in. I thought of Batista, lying in that hospital bed, tethered to life by thin tubes and fragile wires. I thought of the quiet rasp of his voice, the horror slipping through his fingers in broken breaths. Kyle Butler. Robinson's message had been clear. He knew. The police scanner crackled in the quiet, filling the silence with bursts of coded dispatch chatter. I listened, waiting, sifting through noise for something, anything, that would lead me to him. A disturbance. 17th and Biscayne. That wasn't far. A body. That was closer. I was out the door before I had time to think. the dark passenger guiding my movements as I slipped into the humid Miami night. The scene was already swarming by the time I arrived, a pulsing colony of flashing lights and murmuring uniforms. There was something rehearsed about it, the rhythm of investigation, the motion of techs and detectives circling like vultures over fresh meat. It wasn't until I saw the blood that I stopped breathing. Fresh, dark, pooling over cracked pavement, illuminated by the sterile glow of streetlights. Deb was already there, feet planted, hands on her hips, her face carved from something cold. A cigarette burned between her fingers. Forgotten. I followed her gaze. Quinn. His body lay sprawled at an unnatural angle, limbs twisted where they shouldn't be, exposed to the humid night air. His face, God, his face. The familiar features were distorted in agony, eyes dull with the shock of finality. 3 slashes. Perfect. Deliberate. Just like Batista. Jesus fucking Christ. Deb exhaled, her voice hollowed out. She sucked in a breath and turned on me, eyes burning. You're telling me this isn't connected? I stared at the body, my pulse an eerie metronome in my ears. 1 down, Dexter. 2 now. And I was running out of friends. Something low and violent curled in my gut. Quinn hadn't been my favorite person. Far from it. We'd circled each other for years, 2 predators sniffing out each other's secrets. But this, letting him bleed out like a dog in the street, twisted into the shape of someone else's ritual? No, this wasn't how it was supposed to be. This was my city, my world, and Robinson was unraveling it beneath my hands, 1 cut at a time. I turned on my heel without answering Deb, without acknowledging the storm boiling in her eyes. My feet carried me away, through alleyways and shadows, until I slipped into the quiet dark, where no one could see the terrible, coiling fury stretching beneath my ribs. Lance Robinson thought he could play my game. He was wrong. I wasn't going to play at all. I was going to end it. The plastic slid over the steel table with practiced ease, the roll unraveling in smooth, crisp sheets. The room was a sanctuary of silence. My tools lay where they always had, gleaming under the soft hum of fluorescent light. I wasn't just hunting him anymore. I was preparing for the inevitable, the moment our paths would cross, and only one of us would walk away. The night around me was still, holding its breath. I inhaled, exhaled, felt the weight of the city pressing in, and let it settle over me. The hunt wasn't an abstract idea anymore. It was tangible, coiled in my muscles, sharpening my senses. I wasn't waiting for Robinson to make his next move. I was making mine. The only question left was, how do you kill a ghost before it buries you first? I traced the scalpel's edge with my thumb, the biting coolness grounding me. The answer was simple. You don't chase ghosts. You trap them. And trapping was something I did better than anyone. I knew Robinson's type. For all his meticulous planning, all his carefully replicated rituals, he wasn't a master of the game. He was still learning, still refining, still in search of something. And people like that, they couldn't resist the urge to make themselves known to their prey. Quinn was the final warning, the final cut before Robinson would come for the one person who had been inevitable from the start. Deb. He had studied Trinity, absorbed his twisted commandments like scripture, and there was one lesson woven through all of it. Family is where the cycle ends. My fingers tightened around the handle of my knife. Robinson would come for Deborah Morgan, and I would be waiting. Miami breathed around me, its pulse deep and slow as I moved through shadowed streets, my plan assembling itself in pieces. A setup, a frame, a kill. First, I needed bait. I pulled out my phone, my thumbs moving quickly over the screen as I typed out a message to Deb. Meet me at Dad's house. Urgent. Asterisk asterisk. The house had been abandoned for years, left to the elements, aching with its own kind of ghosts. A memory preserved only in wood, dust, and the echoes of lessons I could never unlearn. It was fitting. The place where I had become what I was. The place where the final lesson would be taught. I drove in silence, letting the weight of what was coming finally settle. This wasn't just another kill. This wasn't just another body wrapped in plastic. Another problem tidily erased in the dark. This was a reckoning. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house stood like a fossil beneath the moonlight, its frame warped with time, the windows glaring like empty sockets. I stepped inside, my fingers brushing over the peeling remains of the wallpaper, the soft creak of the wood beneath my boots. The air smelled of abandonment, stale dust and something deeper, something almost sour. It carried weight, the kind that settled over old places, where laughter had once struggled to take root and failed. I walked deeper inside, past the relics of a life that had never truly belonged to me, and prepared. Robinson had studied Trinity, but I had studied something much worse. Me. By the time Deb arrived, the trap was set. Her car pulled up fast, the headlights sweeping over dead grass before cutting to black. The slam of the door, the hard crunch of gravel beneath boots. She stepped inside, her posture sharp, rigid in the way it always got when she knew I was keeping something from her. "Dex." I exhaled through my nose, keeping my face neutral as I turned. "Thanks for coming." Her gaze flicked over me, measuring, tracking. "You gonna tell me what the hell is going on? Or are we just cutting to the part where I beat it out of you?" I almost smirked. Almost. But the words I needed to say next drained any humor from my blood. "He's coming." Deb stared. "Who?" "Robinson." Her jaw clenched. "You sure?" "Yes." She nodded once, sharp. "Then let's make sure he doesn't leave this place alive." God. She had no idea how much I agreed with that sentiment. We moved through the house, positioning ourselves in careful silence. I guided her in directions that would keep her safe, using half-truths and instinct to funnel her awareness away from the pieces I hadn't told her yet. She was here for justice. I was here for something older. Vengeance. The hours stretched, thick and slow, tension wired into our movements. Then, a shadow through the back window. Movement. Robinson had arrived. I felt it before I saw it. An electric hum across my skin, a certainty colder than fear. I turned my head fractionally, enough to see him creeping toward the side entrance, his body a silhouette against the night. He thought he was stalking me, that he was the predator. I almost pitied him. Almost. The door eased open, slow and deliberate, a whisper of air curling into the stale warmth of the house. I waited, perfectly still, watching as he slipped further inside, his presence a quiet disruption against the stillness. He was fast. I was faster. The second he cleared the threshold, I was on him. He must have sensed it a split second before, enough for his body to start shifting, his hand dipping toward his belt. But not fast enough. My fist connected with his temple, sending him staggering back, his body twisting with the force. He caught himself against a table, breath sharp as he swayed, and for a moment, I could see it, the flicker of recognition, the realization that this wasn't going the way he had envisioned. "Kyle," he started. I hit him again. This time, he crumpled, his knees knocking against the floorboards before his body sprawled out entirely. The silence that followed was thick, almost reverent. My pulse was steady, my movements precise as I pulled out the plastic sheeting and worked quickly, securing him before he had the chance to wake. He had come here thinking he had the advantage, but this had never been his kill. It had always been mine. By the time his eyes fluttered open, the recognition bled into something else. Fear. I stood over him, the weight of inevitability pressing down on the space between us. "You wanted to know what it felt like, didn't you?" I mused, tilting my head. To be in his skin, to understand him. He swallowed hard, his throat working around silence. I leaned in close, my voice lowering to something cold. "But you misunderstood something, Robinson. Trinity didn't hunt men like you." His lips parted, a denial, a plea, something. I cut it off with steel. The blade slid between ribs, parting muscle, guided by a hand that had done this 100 times before. Expelling breath, stammering heartbeat, twitching fingers, and then, stillness. Finality settled over the room. The ghost of Trinity was finally silent. By the time the sun rose, the plastic was burned, the blood was erased, and I was just Dexter Morgan again, A quiet man, a forensic analyst, a brother. Deb never saw him vanish, never guessed where he had disappeared to. All she knew was that the killings had stopped, and that somehow, someway, Cal Butler had died that night too.